Tonight's program is being presented by Jason Townsend. And Kim, and say your last name for me again.
Spangrud.
Spangrud is going to introduce Jason to you. Kim?
Thank you for coming tonight, and I would like to thank the Montrose Historical Society and the Montrose History Museum and Sally for hosting this talk tonight. There aren't too many Montrosians, is that what they call Montrosians?
Your choice.
Who don't at least recognize the name Dave Wood, even if they may not know much about him. Almost everyone knows about the Dave Wood Road up on Spring Creek Mesa off of Oak Grove. In fact, a funny thing happened when my husband and I moved here 3 years ago. We were looking at a house that was up on Spring Creek Mesa, and I noticed a road sign that said Dave Wood Road. And so I want to show you what this road sign looked like. It looked like that.
Yeah, all one word.
And I acknowledged that it was similar to the name of a person in my family, in my family's history. Not directly related to me, but had married into my family. But his name was Dave Wood. And so this is what I thought it should have been. And later that fall, we visited the Montrose Historical Museum, and I was completely taken aback when I saw a picture of Samuel Newitt Wood and his son, David Wood, hanging on the wall in the museum. I had seen the same photo many times when researching my extended family history. I think that it was Sally Johnson who later told me about Dave Wood's life here on the Western Slope and his impact. But I didn't understand why the road sign said Dave Wood and not Dave Wood. So it bothered me to no end that the sign was spelled incorrectly, and I even told my husband that I planned to visit it some dark night and change the lettering with duct tape to make it say Dave Wood. I didn't do that, so don't worry. But happily last year sometime, the ghost of Dave Wood must have visited County Road Services and asked them to get it right, because at some point it was fixed. And my friends didn't have to hear me complain about it anymore. But if you don't know about much about Dave Wood, check out the book. I hauled these mountains in here from the library. If you go tomorrow, it won't be there because it's right here. But it was written by his daughters Frances and Dorothy Wood, and it is rich in Colorado history. David Wood built a road. He came in to Colorado probably in the 1870s, and he built a road and transported supplies to the miners and the families in communities all over western Colorado before there was a railroad. He changed the landscape of the Western Slope because he had a certain personal strength and vision that allowed him to achieve amazing things that no one else had achieved. He was the product of families and a community that taught him strength, resilience, and perseverance. And to me, that's what this presentation is about, the alliance and the marriages between the Wood family and the Townsend family, our family, and how these two families were instrumental in helping thousands of slaves find their way to freedom between the years of probably 1820 and 1865, although Jason can nail it down a little bit better than that, through the operation of the Underground Railroad. And I'm pleased to introduce Jason Townsend. I first exchanged emails with Jason, who is my 7th cousin, about 15 years ago while researching my family history on the web. And today is the first day that we actually met face to face. But Jason and I share a common ancestor, the Quaker immigrant John Townsend, who was part of the migration of William Penn's followers to Pennsylvania. John Townsend's older brother Richard arrived on a ship called the Welcome with William Penn in 1682 in Philadelphia, or Pennsylvania. And John, his brother, followed several years later. Since that time, many of the Townsend family members remained involved in the Society of Friends, the Quakers, throughout the 1700s and 1800s, and in many cases, many continue to be active in the Quaker faith. In fact, the Quaker Church in Paonia was organized by Charles Austin Townsend in the 1920s, and members of his family still live in the Hotchkiss, Paonia area. Charles Austin Townsend was a descendant of Quaker immigrants who came to North Carolina in the early 1700s. He and his family left a lasting footprint in the faith communities of Western Colorado. And we have two of the family members here with us today, the Arndts. I'm really happy that they're here. He and his family still live in that area. Jason is a descendant of Eli Townsend and Abigail Mosher Wood, David Wood's aunt, who were leading the Quaker abolitionists in Ohio. He has been married for 11 years to his wife, Laura. They have two children, Elizabeth and Jonathan. Jason has lived near St. Louis, Missouri his entire life and has worked for a worldwide silicon wafer manufacturing company for 25 years in the process improvement engineering group. On the side, he works for the Daniel Amos Band doing web design, CD and vinyl layout, and production and video editing. He has been studying family history for about 40 years. And I think he's only 40, so right out of the crib. In the last few years, focusing on the family's ties with the Underground Railroad. He's the author of two books, The Descendants of Eli Townsend and Abigail Mosher Wood, and there's a copy of it back there just for you to look at. And his newest book, The Townsend Wood Alliance and the Underground Railroad, and there are copies back there just to look at and information about how to order a copy if you'd like one. But just a note, as far as we know, we are not related to the Thomas B. Townsend, the early banker of Montrose. That's a different Townsend family. And for whom the main street and many things in Montrose is named. I did meet Marlene and Ken, and we talked about the Townsends, but as far as we know, unless it was in the 1600s before they came, we're not related, and there's still DNA to be done. But I want to welcome Jason. Thank you so much for coming all this way.
Thanks. The first thing I guess I want to say is the Townsend Wood Alliance. The title comes from some of the Wood family that I've interacted with. The Townsend Wood Alliance was a phrase that was passed down for generations, but the meaning of it got lost. They didn't really know why the family talked about that. But I started researching basically for my kids. There was three groups of families. There was the David Wood family, Thomas Townsend family, and then my own family, the Levi Townsend family. And that's where I found that there's quite a connection between the three families, and that's where this kind of all leads. The first thing I would say too is that I like to look at the context, what all was going on at the time. Not only just, to find all the facts about the family, but then you can interpret them a lot better by finding out what was going on in their area at the time, or what the different laws were, and things like that. For the Townsends coming over from Bucklebury, I would say the king is actually the context, because the king, Henry VIII, passed the law of supremacy in 1534, and that act of supremacy basically was an act where he made himself the king of both the state and the church. They united it into one entity. There was no separation of church and state at all. It was basically the king was the head of the church. They forced everybody to go to the Church of England. Only the king and the monarchs and all of those, the hierarchy could choose the clergy. And so you had people like George Fox, who's the other guy here, create these different groups that were opposed to what was going on there. And so he started the Quakers, the Society of Friends. And so the next thing that happened after he started the Society of Friends, and the Townsends became part of the Society of Friends, I think a little later, but this is not working. The Great Fire of London was one of the next things that occurred in 1666 that destroyed about 80% of London. And so after that point, they started running coaches to London because they needed carpenters and millwrights and blacksmiths and masons. And that's where the Townsends ended up heading to London. And we can go to the next one. That's where Richard Townsend was discovered by William Penn because he was a millwright. And so they loaded his mill onto the Welcome, William Penn's ship, and brought it over with them to Pennsylvania. It was shortly after that like within, I don't know, I think it was like 1712, I think, is when John Townsend came over. That was the brother of Richard. Let's go to the next one. So we have John here. Let's see if this works. Up here at the top. Most of the family that I have researched, I was originally researching from a kid, so I was kind of going straight back from, here's my great-great-grandfather married to Abigail Mosher Wood. And so her line goes up to David Wood. Eli's goes around to Levi, and that goes up to John. Now there's another group here that's Thomas Townsend, which is right here, which I also was researching because his sons were friends with John Brown, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But so they were all involved with the Underground Railroad, but it was also not only was it their religious views that connected them, but also their families. They would marry into the same families. That they would. There was not only were you not supposed to marry outside the faith, it also helped keep the secret, because if you wanted to keep it within the groups so that the word didn't get out, because it was actually quite dangerous to be helping runaways. Let's see. Next. This is John Kirk Townsend. He's one of the descendants. He was an ornithologist that traveled across the country back in 1838. His sisters, Hannah and Mary Townsend, wrote the Anti-Slavery Alphabet, which was a children's book that was put out in 1846, I believe. And it was at an anti-slavery fair that they put out. This is just to show that this goes back. The Quakers were actually opposed to slavery back into the 1600s. So even when they came over, because they were persecuted by the King of England, first Henry VIII, and then later on Elizabeth I, and then after that too, they actually passed laws against the Quakers for not attending the services that to the Church of England. So let's see. Okay, you can go next. This is my great-great-grandfather right here, Levi Townsend. He moved, this is where the connection starts happening for my direct ancestors and the Wood family. But he was an Underground Railroad station master here in Logan County, Ohio. I'm getting lost. the route would go from here over to, sometimes they'd stop at this stop here, William Craddy in Delaware County. There was also some of the Moshers, which are part of David Wood's family that would be in this area. And then they'd go on up here to David Wood, which is Samuel Newett Wood's father. From there, they would go over to this Thomas Townsend, which is the other family that I was researching. Thomas's wife was David Wood's wife's sister. So they were married into the same family as well. So you had this, you know, that they were basically taking people from relatives to other relatives. And so that would help, you know, they could trust those people, basically, is what that amounts to. And then up here, from David Wood's house, you go up to William Lyon's house. Sometimes they would go this way, sometimes they would go this way, depending on what kind of danger was in the area. William Lyon's house, or that's where Samuel Newett Wood met his wife. Two of Levi Townsend's children, my great-great-grandfather Eli and his sister Elizabeth, both married children from the David Wood family. Let's see. They said that, some of the relatives said that Elizabeth Townsend, his daughter, Levi's daughter, would ride with him in the carriages onto the next stations, and she would ride in the back of the wagon with the curtains drawn and ride with the fugitives. And at one point, one of the relatives said that he had told that it was before Gettysburg that a bunch of Confederates had raided the area, and that the only person home at the time was Elizabeth Townsend. And she was young, and she told them that there were no slaves in the house, but they actually were in the cellar. And so they left empty-handed, and he was so proud of her when he got home that the story is that he gave her her own china cup and saucer. And the relative that relayed this story to me said that that's still in the family. I guess they have as an heirloom.
Around what year is that?
Well, I've tried to figure that out because he said it was Confederates, and he said that that would be the only thing that I could think of that happened was John Hunt Morgan's raid into Ohio. But his daughter would be about 40-something years old at that point, so I'm kind of thinking it might have been a granddaughter that was home because they would be much younger. Elizabeth Townsend had several daughters, about 4, and so it could have been one of them. Either that, or it could have been earlier, and it could have been slave catchers because there were a lot of bounty hunters and slave catchers that would come up from the south. And so that's where, you know, some of these the family lore. I take the story and I don't know exactly where it fits. Some of the details are probably correct, but some of the facts might be off. Okay, so we go on to the next one. That's David Wood and Esther Mosher, Samuel Newett Wood's parents. They moved there to Delaware County, Ohio first, and then they moved into the Alum Creek, Morrow County, Ohio. Samuel Newett Wood himself said, "I was thoroughly anti-slavery. My father's house had always been open to the fugitive slave. And many a time I have traveled the entire night guiding them on the road towards the North Star and the land of freedom. It was on one of these occasions I first met my wife. Her father was a deacon in the Presbyterian church, and for feeding a fugitive had been arraigned before the session of the church, and the church was rent in twain. It's needless to say that she inherited no love for slavery." David Wood said, he's talking about his grandfather David. "David was active in the Underground Railroad in Morrow County, along with his father Jonathan Sr., his son Samuel, and his brother Jonathan. Also active was his nephew Richard, son of his brother Daniel. They all served as agents at the second station in Morrow County. Also involved were the three of his wife's brothers, Robert, Joseph, and John Mosher. So they had quite a network. You know, I've often heard people say that they were unorganized, the Underground Railroad was unorganized, and I think they were very organized by default, simply because it was a lot of the same religious groups, and it was also the family. They were connected by, you know, their families, and they, like I said, the Quakers married within the same groups. Ruth Teresa Wood Pierce, another one of David Wood's daughters, said over 160 colored people fleeing from slavery were in less than 9 months fed at their tables. There's a story which is, I've been told is possibly questionable information, but I include it with that caveat, but they say that there was a tunnel under the roadway where a runaway slave could escape from their house. It says on one occasion, slave hunters came to David Wood's home and they were invited to sit down to breakfast. Esther read from the Bible before they could eat, and she read very slowly so the slaves could be taken out and away. The hunters did catch up with David and Esther's son, Sam, driving the wagon. They stopped him and asked him what he was hauling, and he said, and he uses a derogatory term which I will not use, he says, "I got 10 such and such in the wagon." Thinking he was joking, they let him go on. He did have slaves in the wagon, and they safely reached the next stop. I think sometimes his brashness helped him out. So if we go on to the next one. Thomas Townsend in Knox County, he's the other Townsend that was also a brother-in-law, David Wood Townsend. He was, I forget, it's a second cousin, once removed, I think, or something like that, of Levi Townsend. Let's see. His daughter, Letitia Ann, said, "Father was a strong abolitionist, and his voice rang with no uncertain sound in support of the cause. I remember so well when the Society of Friends took a stand against anything made by slaves, and this necessitated us wearing clothes all very much alike, as the variety of patterns to be secured from other sources was decidedly limited. I think that the younger ones of the families sometimes rebelled at having to wear the plain similar patterns, but we submitted, as what our parents believed to be the right thing to do, and we did it." I think another part of that is, you know, that if you think about the Society of Friends as a whole, they were almost, if you think it was back to the King Henry VIII and the Church of England, the church was opulent, it was regal, it was very rich, connected to the king. There was a hierarchy that only the king allowed certain people to preach. And the Quakers almost did the exact opposite. They were plain, they allowed anyone to stand up and preach. It was almost like a direct contrast, you know, to what they were doing. And I thought that section where she talked about not buying from places that you know, use slaves to make the clothing, I never even thought about that, but that could explain a lot of the plain clothing that they used. If you go on to the next one. This is Eli Townsend and Abigail Mosher Wood. They were from Morrow County, but they were involved in that area on the Underground Railroad, but they also, let's see, let me read this first. When they were in the Allen Creek area, an event took place where a runaway mother and 3 sons, 14, 9, and 3, arrived at the William Benedict farm seeking assistance. They were hidden away since the slave owners were scouring the area. A few weeks later, the slave owner and 2 hired men burst into the yard and grabbed the 3 sons, ready to take them away. Within minutes, 25 to 30 Quakers arrived, convince the men to let the boys go. The slave owner, still holding the 14-year-old boy, argued he should be able to keep his property, to which William Benedict replied, "Stop calling human beings property." The slave owner was later quoted as saying, "The Quakers rose right up out of the ground." And I think that's, again, their connections. They were able to communicate with their whole area. You know, they had meetings, monthly meetings, they knew each other, they were all connected. And so that's, you know, it kind of goes against that whole idea that they were very loosely organized. Let's see. Yeah, I guess we can go to the next one. Well, go back first, because there's a part here that I want to talk about. He moved to Niles, Michigan. Eli and Abigail moved to Niles, Michigan in 1847. Niles, Michigan, the Cass County, Barron County, and Cass County, Michigan were very important on the Underground Railroad because the two lines merged. The Ohio line and the Quaker line both merged at Niles. And they would go up from there through Cass County on to Detroit. When I was researching, well, there's a story that goes along with this, the Kentucky Raid, but I was also researching the Charles Austin Townsend family. His great-grandfather lived in Plainfield, right here, and it's right, he was a Society of Friends member, and he's on an Underground Railroad route. So I was trying to look to see if he was connected because he's the right religion and the right place at the right time, 1840s, same time my great-great-grandfather's right up here. I couldn't find anything that substantiated it exactly, but I did find, you know, a lot of these things, since a lot of the records were destroyed or they just didn't keep any, it's hard to verify a lot of this, but you can look at, you know, Society of Friends, he's living on a route, and then his sister wrote to him, let's see if I can find it here. So I'm going to play this. Here it is. Okay. He had a sister named Esther Newby Hollowell, who was still in North Carolina. The family of William Townsend, the great-great-grandfather of Charles Austin Townsend, were still living in North Carolina, and they were thinking of moving up to Indiana. And so she says, she wrote a letter that says, Frederick and Jacob talk of coming next spring, and if they do, I shall try to come if I can get there, but I don't know how that will be. I have neither horse, cart, nor not much of anything else. And then she starts talking about their Quaker community. They had free blacks living amongst them. And so she says, it's the black ones, old Sarah and her children. I cannot bear the thought of leaving them here, and they have nothing to carry them away. Old Sarah says she will go if we do. My dear sister has been very consumed about them for many years, not knowing what would become of them. She told me a few days before her death to write to thee to come here and help us get them away to the land of freedom. We should be very glad to see thee come to this land if it was not too great of an undertaking. If thee would come or send something to help get these black ones away, for if they stay here, they will certainly be made slaves of somebody or other, I expect. So right there, he's on the route, he's a Society of Friends member, and he's got a relative who at least thinks that he's willing to come and help people come north. So I thought that was kind of cool that he's right there on the same route. What happened with the Kentucky Raid, which is something I want to get to. Kentucky Raid. Actually, Eli Townsend and his brother Abner Watson Townsend were both living. Abner was up in Cass County, and Eli was up in Barron County. And in 1847, I guess we can move to the next one because it's going to be part of it. That's not it. I thought I had. Okay. I'll go ahead and go back. Sorry about that. In 1847, some of the people that were married into Eli's family, he was married into the Brown family. There were some other people that were abolitionists from where the family came from in Ohio. They moved up there too. Well, in 1847, a bunch of slave catchers from Kentucky raided that area up there in Cass County and Niles, Berrien County, Cass County, and the slave catchers were led by Francis Townsend. They raided the Bogue, East Osborne, and Sugar farms, capturing 9 fugitive slaves. Word spread quickly, and before long, 300 Quakers, free blacks, and other abolitionists, townspeople gathered and a confrontation ensued at the Odell's Mill in Vandalia. The Kentuckians brandished weapons, but before any violence took place, the Quakers intervened. Believing the law was on their side, the Kentuckians agreed to go to Cassopolis and stand trial. The captives were detained in a local tavern, and the Kentuckians had to post bond to stay out of jail. There was a 3-day delay in the trial proceedings to allow the Kentuckians to gather documentations to prove ownership of the captives. Since the Cass County Circuit Court Commissioner was absent, the Berrien County Commissioner, Ebenezer McIlvaine, who was an Underground Railroad conductor in Niles, took his place. When the trial began, the Quakers, free blacks, and fugitives filed charges against the Kentuckians. McIlvaine ruled in favor of the freedom seekers and said that the Kentuckians didn't provide the right paperwork. The captives were freed, and the 34 other fugitive slaves left for Canada. The Kentuckians returned to the South empty-handed. But in February of 1848, the Kentuckians filed suit against the Cass County Quakers, Stephen Bogue, Josiah Jefferson, Elias Osborne, Ishmael Lee. Ishmael Lee was married into, he was a relative by marriage into the Townsend family. Joel East and Zachariah Sugar, along with David T. Nicholson, William Jones, Commissioner Ebenezer McIlvaine, and the U.S. District Court of Detroit for value of their property. The defense attorney was an abolitionist named Jacob Merritt Howard. The trial went on for 2 years, and eventually a settlement was brokered and funded by David T. Nicholson, amounting to $2,000 covering court costs. The settlement was not supported by the Quakers, but the Kentuckians came away empty-handed again. So what happened, that pretty much led to that raid because they did not enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. We can go on to the next one then. They passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 basically made it so that the authorities themselves could be prosecuted and fined and imprisoned if they didn't enforce the slave laws. And so that happened in 1850. When that happened, almost all of the free blacks and runaways up there in Cass County fled to Canada. Eli Townsend, which is another circumstantial evidence of him being involved, that same year moved back to Ohio. So once the whole operation ended, a lot of the people left. So the Fugitive Slave Act inspired Uncle Tom's Cabin. Let's see. So then the next thing that happens, Jacob Townsend and the Christiana Riot. Jacob Townsend is he's a little bit different branch, but he's still a descendant of John Townsend. And I kind of came across him just lately. If you've seen Who Do You Think You Are, the show Who Do You Think You Are, there's an episode with, I'm not sure if I pronounce her name correctly, but it's like Zoe Deschanel. They talk about the Pownell Farm and the Christiana Riot. The Christiana Riot was an event where it was in 1851, and it kind of relates to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 because of the way they handled it. In September 11th, 1851, Edward Gorsuch, a slave owner from Maryland, arrived at the home of William Parker, a runaway slave, whose home was on the land of Levi and Sarah Henderson Pownell, about 3 miles from the home of Jacob R. Townsend, which is this guy right here. The two of Gorsuch's slaves were hiding at the Parker home. Gorsuch had arrived with his son Dickinson, Deputy Marshal Henry H. Klein, and several other relatives to apprehend the fugitives. The Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, run by William Still, who was up in Philadelphia, he was a guy that wrote a big book and cataloged a lot of the fugitive slaves and runaways stories. He had sent Samuel Williams, a black Underground Railroad conductor, to warn Parker and the runaways that Gorsuch was coming. When Gorsuch arrived, Eliza, Parker's wife, blew a horn which summoned sympathetic neighbors, and about 50 armed black men showed up as well. Gorsuch shouted that he would not leave without his property, and a battle ensued. Gorsuch was shot and killed, and his son badly wounded. Everyone else fled. William Parker went into hiding that evening and used contacts in the Underground Railroad to make his way to Rochester, New York. Frederick Douglass assisted his passage to Canada. The U.S. Marines were called in to bring about order. Afterward, about 100 men, women, and children were arrested. All but 5 were black. Castor Hanaway, which is, I believe, this guy right here, I think. I can see that, but I think that's him. Elijah Lewis and Joseph Scarlett, that's all 3 of these guys. Elijah Lewis and Joseph Scarlett were taken to Mayam Sing prison to await trial for treason. Jacob Townsend here was charged with treason as well. His name did not appear on the original prison docket, so he was charged with treason, but for some reason he didn't end up in prison. His reason for being charged for treason was that on that morning, a young runaway by the name of John Roberts came to his house and was headed to the farm where this event was going to take place because they were warned. Jacob Townsend loaded a rifle and gave it to him to take with him to help defend himself. And so by handing that loaded rifle, he was charged with treason. So on November 24th, 1851, they did a test trial on Castor Hanaway, right here, because he was erroneously thought to be the leader of the resistance. The trial took place in Independence Hall. Lucretia Mott and other abolitionists had raised money for his defense. The abolitionist Congressman Thaddeus Stevens led the defense. There was standing room only, as many reporters and members of the Society of Friends were in attendance. After 14 days of deliberation, and due to lack of eyewitness accounts, Hanaway was acquitted by the grand jury, and all charges against the others were dropped. So there's a lot of speculation that because of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, they didn't want to seem to be not enforcing the slave laws. And so a lot of people believe that they charged them with treason to look as if they were being very hard on these people that were helping. But in fact, treason, since it was punishable by death, required a very high level of evidence. And so that kind of led them all off. And so I think they were kind of playing politics there a little bit. The other part of this, which is very interesting, is Edward Gorsuch's younger son, who stayed home. His name was Thomas Gorsuch. He was in school. His best friend was John Wilkes Booth, and they swore revenge for their father's murder. So you can see how each event, you got the riot in Kentucky, the Fugitive Slave Act, then this riot, and then that leads to the next step.
What was the treasonous act? I'm not sure.
I think it was just, since there were already laws on the books for not assisting runaway slaves, I think they were counting it as a crime against the state, I think. I don't know, it's kind of, they just kind of went for the highest thing they could go, I guess, but, yeah, because they charged him with treason for handing a rifle to somebody, so it seems a little grasping. But. So the next event after this is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which leads to the possible expansion of slavery here in Nebraska and Kansas, which will lead us to Samuel Newett Wood. So if we go on to the next one, I just had that there just to say the next step. Samuel Newett Wood, he was part of the abolitionist movement back in he was a conductor in Ohio, but he was a lawyer at the time whenever the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed. And he's told them that if the bill passed, he would go to Kansas and fight all over again. So Samuel Newett Wood says, Mr. Brumbaugh said to me, the bill will pass, and then what will you do about it? I said, if the bill passes, I, for one, will go to Kansas and help fight the fight all over again. I recollect I was cheered, but I did not think what I was saying at the time. I had no idea of going to Kansas, but in the course of the next 30 days, the question was frequently asked of me when I was going to start. It became evident to me, as everyone else, that the bill was going to pass. One night, I went home and told my wife that as soon as the bill passed, I was going to Kansas and asked her what she would do. She said if I would go, she was going also. The bill passed, and on May 30 and on June 6th, we, that is myself, my wife, and 2 children, were on the road to Kansas, and we had never heard of the Immigrant Aid Company. The Immigrant Aid Company was a group that was helping bring people from outside of Kansas into Kansas, and they actually set up this hotel which was burned at the sacking of Lawrence. When Samuel Wood was there in Kansas, he set up he went to Booneville, Missouri to get the presses for the Kansas Tribune. He actually set up the what was it called? They set up a paper. I was trying to think what it's called. The Herald of Freedom Press, which was an anti-slavery newspaper that he ran there in Kansas. Let's see. Oh, at the same time, around the same time, one of the first people that was one of the first free staters that was murdered in Kansas around this same area was in 1856. It was Captain Reese Perkins Brown, which was another part of the Brown family that was married into the. They were part of the same group of abolitionists that were in Ohio that moved to Michigan, and then they were here too. So that's another family. There was the Moshers, the Woods, the Townsends, and the Browns that were all kind of intermingled. Let's see.
Do you know where in Kansas that was?
This here is Lawrence. This was the hotel that the Immigrant Aid Company had set up.
I just meant what town.
Lawrence, Kansas.
Lawrence,
Didn't
yeah.
hear that.
I don't know if I have that. Well, let's see. Samuel Wood, when he was in Kansas, I'm not going to go through everything that he did because he was involved in a lot. But he also went up to. He was a delegate and spoke at Avalon Hall for the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania Convention, which organized the Republican Party. After remarks from Burroughs of New York and Vaughn and Chicago Tribune and Sackett of New York and Raymond and Pennsylvania, and a bunch of others, there were loud calls made for Samuel Newett Wood of Kansas. He was celebrated for the prominent part he took in the recent troubles in Kansas. He made a long, telling, and humorous speech, convulsing the audience with laughter. He narrated the experience as captain of a little party which rescued Branson, the Sheriff Jones. He was severe on President Pierce. He was, the New York Times said he was the lion of the evening. I guess that's maybe later. If we go on to the next one, am I running out of time? Am I good?
A few more.
Okay. This is William and James Townsend. They moved to West Branch in the 1850s. They were part of the Thomas Townsend line, so they were all involved in the Underground Railroad. Says Charles Townsend, one of the sons, says, I think it was about a year after we came that Uncle James and family came, Uncle Timothy Kirk and family, soon Uncle Thomas Barrington and family, and then Aunts Mary and Letitia, and still later Uncle Blackburn Vore and family. Says father was prominently identified with the building up of the little town, and I was trying to find the part where he's here we go. Jesse R. Townsend, the son of James, says James Townsend was a pronounced anti-slavery advocate, and our Knox County log house was one of the main stations on the Underground Railroad. Many a weary, frightened Canada-bound fugitive found shelter and comfort under the Townsend roof. And my mother's sweet ministering of love and Christ-like sympathy. The stories related by those slaves and their weird plantation songs were of stirring interest to all of our household. Father tells of one of those slaves who was hotly pursued by his master and was hiding in the wheat bin of our barn. And as she received a platter of breakfast which mother had sent to him, he drew a large dagger knife from his belt, which he looked decidedly warlike to the Quaker. And in answer to the question whether he would use it if overtaken by his master, replied, well, it ain't my disposition to molest nobody, but if you try to take me back, I don't know what I would do. It took courage to act as an agent on this night's transportation of bondsmen, guided by the pole star to the land of freedom. But I am proud that my father faltered not even in the face of danger and was never harmed in his labor of love for the fleeing bondsman. I remember with what keen interest father and mother read to the family the thrilling story of Uncle Tom's Cabin, then being published in the Weekly National Era. How at intervals we would all weep, and then the crying would turn into irrepressible laughter as the author would graphically picture those plantation scenes under the peculiar rule of those slavery days. He had an inn called the Traveler's Rest, and John Brown would stop there and stay in his inn for free. And James Townsend said, I was well acquainted with John Brown, and he and his men often stopped with me when passing through West Branch. Where in those early times they kept the Traveler's Rest, they made frequent expeditions into Kansas and Missouri, carrying supplies to aid the warfare being waged between freedom and slavery. One evening, he surprised us by driving into the yard with a few teams, several of his men, and about 14 colored people whom he informed us he had rescued from slavery. The little Quaker community began gathering in, ministers and elders coming to expostulate with me for harboring such warlike men and remaining to listen to the story of their exploits. Although many relics have been parted with, I have several letters from Brown's men, some written after their capture at Harper's Ferry, which occurred soon after the events I have been relating. When reports came that the attack that there was great excitement, and my wife, he's writing to somebody, he says, your aunt, fearing we should be implicated, destroyed many letters and other articles which would be valuable as relics now. he actually, he was one of the only people that knew the story of what was going to happen. One of the, I think it was, John Henry Caggie. No, I think it was, I'm trying to think. Oh, here it is. In October of 1859, Richard Ralph, who was one of John Brown's secretary and state of his engaging provisional government, was arrested in Texas and sent to Washington, D.C., where he testified that Mr. Townsend was one of the only people that John Brown might have related his plans to. Some of the others who were at least partially in the know were John H. Painter, Dr. H.C. Gill, and of course William Maxon, where he trained. But he also moved to Pasadena, California, where some of John Brown's sons lived, and was one of the pallbearers for Owen Brown out there in California. So, I don't know. Keep going? Or wrap it up?
Well, we're about to run out of time.
Okay.
Go ahead and wrap it up.
Okay. Well, after that, the next thing I was going to get into was basically the emancipation, which is, where all of this comes to an end, and then it was actually Samuel Wood that signed the law in Kansas that abolished slavery in Kansas. So,
That was Dave Wood's father, our Dave Wood's father.
yeah. And then they also got into, a lot of the family got into the freedmen schools. They set up, the Society of Friends set up schools around the South, and a lot of these people in these families, the Townsends and the Woods, taught at these schools, and tried to teach, educate the people that were free. And a lot of times, in the case of one of them, there's Joseph Mosher Wood and his wife Elizabeth Townsend. They were in Virginia, and the schoolhouse was an ex-slave pen, so they had all the chains and stuff on the walls. Yes, I.
Do you have questions? If you have questions for Jason, he'll try to answer them.
Okay.
It seems like the history was so well preserved in so many cases. What do you think contributed to the line and the passing on of all of the history and traditions?
I think I've thought about this a little bit because I've heard one of the criticisms of Underground Railroad station talks is that a lot of the African community is not represented well. But if you think about a lot, that's true, but a lot of them fled to Canada, so they weren't, a lot of these families that were assisting were still in the towns and still had interviews with newspapers and had, their obituaries sometimes talked about some of their exploits. And William H. Siebert and William Henry Siebert did a lot of study and interviewed a lot of people. I get a lot of information. You can go on, I think it's Ohio Memory. They have William H. Siebert's whole underground collection is on there for free. And you can look at a lot of Underground Railroad stuff from Ohio, at least. He interviewed a lot of people. I don't know, I think, for me it was, when I started looking at some of these people, you have these events that were so dramatic. And then you start seeing where some of the family was in those areas. I think the events sometimes have a lot of information that you can kind of glean, but more so than even my great-great-great-grandfather Levi Townsend. I can't find a lot of stories on him. I know he was involved. William H. Siebert lists him, but I can't find any stories.
Our Dave Wood here, I know when he was 14 years old, he was fighting in the Civil War. How does he tie in? Which one of these is his ancestor and so forth?
Okay. David Wood, that was here, His father was Samuel Newitt Wood. Samuel Newitt Wood was the guy that was involved in basically every aspect of the Bleeding Kansas stuff. He was right in the middle of every bit of it. His sister was married to my great-great-grandfather, Eli Townsend. His brother was married to my great-great-grandfather's sister, Elizabeth Townsend. So the family married twice into the same family. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they were basically the next stop on the line. So, you know, they were probably traveling back and forth and back and forth there. So the Woods and the Townsends they're actually connected in multiple places, but David Wood was right from that line. All the Wood people that I talked about are his family.
Let's go back to, was he born in Kansas then, or in Ohio or Indiana?
David Wood,
Kansas.
yeah, was it Kansas? Yeah. I was trying to think, because
He was in business in
Ohio.
Kansas prior to coming to Colorado.
yeah, I remember at least a couple of his kids came with him.
Pick it up in the book.
Yeah. I was trying to remember because I feel like one or two of the children was born in Ohio and maybe one was born in Kansas.
Yeah.
I forget which is which.
The local people, he was in business.
County, Ohio.
He was born in Ohio.
Morrow County, Ohio.
He was in business. in Kansas.
1851.
Yeah, and so when he went to the Civil War, he wasn't actually enlisted, he just went with his father.
Yeah,
And
Snuck along with
he
his
just
dad.
stuck along, yeah.
yeah. I think the story was that his dad was heading off on horseback. It was the Kansas Rangers, I think.
Yeah.
And he looked back and his son was following him on a little horse, I guess, or a pony or something, I don't know. Yeah, there's a picture. And he got malaria, and they had to leave him. They were traveling through a certain area, I think it was in Arkansas maybe, and he got malaria and they had to leave him with the farm and come back for him later. Anybody else?
I think Karen has put out the refreshments, so help yourself. Drive home safely.
Yeah, I look at that, sure.